Desolation is spreading. Launch the probe.
Systems optimal. Launching.
Monitor all channels. Report anomalies.
It was not dramatic. It was just data. A small rocky planet, third from its star, wrapped in a thick atmosphere, covered mostly in liquid water. The Vrethkai automated systems flagged it under 4 different danger categories before the first analyst even opened the file. Class 7 Death World. Extreme surface radiation variance. Volatile atmospheric electrical activity. Apex fauna registered across 6 continental zones. Biosphere density rated catastrophic for unprotected organic entry. The analyst sent it up the chain. The chain sent it to the council. The council looked at it for exactly 11 minutes before assigning a survey team. Rail was in the middle of recalibrating a sensor array when the assignment came through. He read it once, put down his tools, and read it again. He had surveyed 19 worlds in his career. Most of them had been straightforward. Find the dominant creature, observe it, record its behavior, classify it, file the report. Occasionally, one of those creatures made things complicated, but the job was always the same in the end. He called Das first. Das was older, calm, the kind of person who never raised his voice and never wasted a word. He read the assignment file and said only, "Looks cold." He meant the planet. Rael agreed. Itha was the youngest of the 3. She was assigned to them by the council rather than chosen, which sometimes created friction on survey teams. It did not with her. She asked 12 questions before they even boarded the survey vessel, all of them good ones. She wanted to know about the fauna distribution, the atmospheric entry window, the estimated intelligence tier of the local species. The last question made Rael pause. The file had not classified local intelligence. It had classified local danger. Those were usually the same thing, but not always. They entered the atmosphere at night on the dark side of a large landmass covered in dense forest. The vessel had full acoustic dampening. They dropped below cloud cover and found a clearing between old trees, wide enough, soft ground underneath. The landing was quiet. The forest was not. Sound hit them the moment the hatch opened. Layers of it. Insects in frequencies they had never processed. Something large moving through brush 200 meters north. Whined through branches. A distant call from something that sounded almost like a horn but was not. The air was wet and heavy and smelled like soil and decay, and something faintly sweet underneath all of it. Das stepped out first and ran his scanner in a slow arc. 17 distinct species within immediate range. 4 of them flagged as potentially dangerous. He marked them on the shared display and moved to set the first perimeter sensor without being asked. Itha stood at the hatch for a moment before stepping down. She was looking up. Through the gaps in the canopy, the sky was clear and the stars were thick. She noted quietly that the planet was beautiful. Rael did not disagree. They worked in practice silence. Perimeter sensors at 8 points. Thermal cloaking panels raised on 3 sides of the camp. Scent barrier emitters placed low to the ground. Motion wire stretched between trees at knee height. Everything was where it should be. Everything was functioning. They slept in shifts. Rael took the first watch. 3 hours in, Sensor 4 went offline. Not destroyed, not shorted, just offline. He pulled up the external feed and saw the unit lying flat on the ground, placed gently on its side in the exact spot where it had been standing. Something had walked up to it, understood that it was a device of some kind, and laid it down without breaking it. Rael did not wake the others. He watched the perimeter feed for the next hour without moving. At the 2-hour mark, he found the other thing. At the eastern edge of the camp, just outside the thermal panel coverage, there was a small bundle sitting on a flat rock. He had to pull the feed from the secondary camera to see it clearly. Dried meat, tied with a strip of plant fiber. Several small dark fruits arranged beside it, placed neatly, deliberately. The motion sensors had not recorded anything entering or leaving the perimeter area. He woke Das. Das looked at the feed for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at Rael, then back at the feed. Itha woke on her own a few minutes later, the way people do when something changes in the air around them. She came and looked at the screen over their shoulders and said nothing for almost a minute. Then she said, "It left us food." Rail said, "Yes." She said, "It knew we were here. It figured out the perimeter. It found a gap in our sensors and it left us food." Das said, "And it did it without triggering anything, without making a sound we could catch." They stood there in the dark of the survey vessel looking at the screen. Outside, the forest continued its noise, indifferent to all of them. Something out there had found 3 alien surveyors hiding behind cloaking panels and thermal barriers and motion wire, and its response had been to bring them something to eat. Rail opened his log and recorded the time, the sensor reading, the camera feed reference, and then sat for a moment before writing the last line. "Whatever is on this world already knows we are here. It is not afraid of us, and it has tried to communicate." He closed the log and looked out at the trees. He had surveyed 19 worlds. He had never written a sentence like that before. Ward had been in this forest for 9 days when the compass started behaving strangely. He noticed it on the morning of the 10th day while marking his position before heading toward the river. The needle drifted. Not a lot, just enough. He tapped the casing out of habit, the way people do with things they trust and want to trust again. It drifted again. He put it away and used the tree lines and sun angle instead, which he could do without thinking. Something had landed nearby. He had not seen it. He had heard the air move at around 2 in the morning, a low, smooth pressure change that did not match wind and did not match any animal he knew. His fire had been down to coals by then, and the forest around him had gone briefly quiet, the way forests do when something new enters them. Then the sound came back, and he lay still for another hour listening before he decided it was not a threat. Not yet, anyway. He found the first sign the next morning. A section of undergrowth 30 meters off the game trail, flattened in a pattern too even to be natural. No claw marks, no scat, no hair on the bark. Whatever had come through here did not move like any animal he had studied, and Ward had studied quite a few. He crouched over the area for a long time, reading what the ground was willing to tell him. Then he found the sensor. It was small and dark, and had been placed between 2 tree roots with the kind of deliberate positioning that meant someone had thought about sight lines. He did not touch it. He studied it from several angles, noted the material, nothing he recognized, and marked the spot on his field map with a small pencil dot. He found 2 more over the next 2 hours, both of them placed with the same careful thought about angle and coverage. Whatever had landed out here was watching the area. It had equipment. It thought in terms of perimeters and observation fields. That was not animal behavior. That was planning. Ward sat on a log and ate a piece of dried bread and thought about it. He was not afraid. He was familiar enough with fear to recognize when it was useful and when it was just noise. This did not feel like a situation where fear would help. What it felt like was a situation where being calm and readable and non-threatening might matter quite a lot. He left food at what he estimated was the edge of their perimeter that evening. Dried meat from his pack, and some berries he had collected from a bush he knew was safe for most mammals. He placed it on a flat rock where a thermal or optical sensor would have a clear view of him doing it. He moved slowly and kept his hands visible, and did not look directly at the spots where he believed they were watching from. Then he went back to his camp and wrote in his journal for an hour before sleeping. The following afternoon Itha snapped the branch. She was 12 meters up in an old oak, repositioning for a better angle on Ward's camp below. The branch was thicker than it looked and the sound was not loud, but in a forest that had gone quiet it landed like a word. Ward stopped walking. He was on the path between his camp and the river, carrying an empty water container. He stopped and turned toward the sound in one smooth motion, not jerking, not flinching. He raised both hands open in front of him, palms out, fingers spread, and looked directly at the tree. He could not see Itha, the cloaking held. but he was looking at the right branch. He spoke in a steady voice, not loud, conversational almost. The translation module in Rail's earpiece caught the broad phonetic shape of it but had no reference language yet. What it could not translate it still somehow carried in tone. The words were calm. There was no uptick of threat hormones in the atmosphere around him, no tension in his posture. He waited. He waited for almost 2 full minutes, hands still raised, looking at the tree. Then he lowered his hands slowly, let them fall to his sides, and looked once more at Itha's position with something in his expression that Rail would spend a long time thinking about afterward. It was not relief. It was not fear. It looked, against all reasonable expectation, like patience. Ward turned and walked back to his camp at the same pace he had been walking before. No faster. He did not look back. Inside the cloaked perimeter, the three of them stayed still for a long time. Das finally spoke. He said, "He knew our exact position." Itha, still in the tree, said quietly, "He knew before I made any noise. He was already adjusting his path to give us more space." Rail did not say anything. He was running the data from their sensor array. Ward's biometrics from a distance scan, heart rate, cortisol markers, muscle tension, all of it steady, all of it calm. The numbers looked like someone reading a book on a quiet afternoon. An entity with no visible weapons, no natural armor, and no apparent ability to detect cloaked technology had found their perimeter, identified their sensor positions, brought them food, located Itha in a tree at 12 meters, and responded to potential first contact with 2 minutes of patient, open-handed stillness. Rail opened his log. He stared at the blank entry field for a while. Then he wrote, "The subject is not behaving like prey. It is also not behaving like a predator. I do not currently have a category for what it is doing." He saved the entry and looked out at the empty path where Ward had been standing. The forest had gone back to its usual noise. Somewhere above them, a bird called 3 times and went quiet. Grath did not read the full report. He read the summary, the threat assessment score, and the final line where Rail wrote that he did not have a category for the subject's behavior. He closed the file there and sent a reply that said, "I will provide you a category." He arrived with 6 soldiers aboard a heavy-class insertion vessel, the kind used for planetary suppression operations on worlds with aggressive megafauna. The ship was designed to absorb significant physical damage. Grath had used it on worlds where the dominant species had a body mass of several tons and a territorial instinct that expressed itself by dismantling whatever entered its range. He landed 15 kilometers from Rail's position on the far side of a low ridge near a human settlement. The settlement was small by his estimates. A few dozen structures, some larger communal buildings, a water tower, roads made of compressed stone material, several wheeled vehicles parked along the edges, lights in windows, thin smoke from some of the chimneys. He watched it for 40 minutes on his thermal array before moving. His assessment was simple. The creatures inside were small, soft, and clustered in a predictable area. A low-yield stun pulse into the open ground near the settlement edge would cause a panic response. The creatures would scatter into the open. His team would collect a manageable number of specimens for study and withdraw. Clean, fast, professionally executed. He fired the pulse at dusk. The ground near the settlement's eastern edge lit up with a sharp, flat concussion of light and sound. It was designed to overwhelm sensory systems without causing lasting damage. On most worlds it produced immediate chaos, creatures running in every direction, easy to track and intercept. The settlement's lights went out, all of them simultaneously within 4 seconds. Grath watched the thermal feed. Movement inside the buildings fast and organized, not scattering, consolidating. People moving away from windows, toward interior walls, toward lower floors. Children being moved first based on the size signatures. Then stillness. The thermal feed showed a settlement of several dozen individuals who had gone from ordinary evening activity to complete coordinated concealment in under 90 seconds. No screaming. He had audio coverage of the area and there was no screaming. He told his unit to advance. They moved in a standard spread formation toward the settlement's main road. Grath kept his scanner active. The settlement was quiet, too quiet. He had done enough field operations to know the difference between a location that was empty and a location that was waiting. The first sign was the sensor going offline on his left flank. He checked the unit, no damage reading, just dark. He sent a soldier to check, and the soldier reported back that the unit had been cleanly detached from its mount and placed on the ground. No tool marks, done by hand. The second sign was the perimeter camera on the north edge cutting to static. Same cause. Then the humans appeared. They did not appear all at once. They materialized in pieces. A shape behind a wall on the left side. Two more behind a vehicle on the right. A single figure prone on the roof of a low building ahead, visible only because Grath's scanner caught the barrel of a long weapon. They were in dark gear, moving low and slow, communicating with hand signals and short, quiet sounds that his translation module could not process fast enough to follow. Grath ordered his unit to raise weapons and hold position. The humans did not charge. They did not retreat either. They did something he had not seen in years of field operations. They stopped moving entirely, held their positions, and waited, as if they understood that the next action would define everything that followed and they were content to let him make it. His left flank reported movement behind them. His right flank reported that the vehicle they had passed on the way in was now occupied. He did not know when that had happened. Then one of his soldiers was simply gone. Grath looked at the position marker and it had not moved, which meant the communication unit was still there. But when he looked at the visual feed from that soldier's position, he saw only ground. He tried the comm. Silence. He sent the soldier beside that position to check. That soldier found the missing team member sitting against a post, wrists secured behind them with a thin plastic fastening, weapon placed 6 meters away, unharmed and furious. There were no footprints approaching from any direction that made sense. Whatever had done, it had used the road's shadows and the distraction of watching the front to take someone from the middle of the formation. Grath ordered a full withdrawal. His unit moved back to the vessel in good order, but the whole way back he could feel the positions shifting around them at the edges of his scanner range, staying just at the limit, not following, just watching to make sure they left. Inside the vessel, one of his soldiers asked if they should return with heavier equipment. Grath was quiet for a long time before answering. Then he said, "Not yet," and he opened his report file and sat with it for almost an hour before writing anything, because he was trying to find a way to describe what had happened that did not make his unit sound like they had been outmaneuvered in a dark village by creatures with no advanced technology. In the end, he wrote it plainly, because there was no other way to write it. On the observation ship above, Rail read the report twice. Then he got up, walked to the forward observation window, and looked down at the dark curve of the planet below. He stayed there for a long time without moving. The data room on the observation ship was small and always slightly too cold. Rail had spent most of the past 30 hours in it, and had stopped noticing the temperature somewhere around hour 9. He had pulled everything the passive arrays had collected on the human world over the past several decades: radio signals, optical feeds from long-range telescopes, encrypted military transmissions that their systems had partially decoded, documentary recordings broadcast openly into the atmosphere on electromagnetic frequencies, apparently intended for distribution across the planet. He started with the oldest material and worked forward. The first thing that struck him was the scale of the conflict record. Not that humans fought. Most species with sufficient intelligence and resource competition fought. What struck him was the documentation. Humans had recorded their wars in extraordinary detail, not just the outcomes, the strategies, the failures, the individual decisions made by individual people under pressure, the logistical chains, the political reasoning, the moral arguments on both sides. They had written books about battles that happened centuries before any of this recording technology existed, based on physical evidence and surviving accounts, because they wanted to understand what had happened and why. He watched footage of large mechanized armies crossing open ground. He watched aerial bombardment. He watched detailed reconstructions of naval operations across open ocean. He read translated accounts of sieges that had lasted years. He found records of a conflict from the previous century that had involved most of the planet simultaneously and resulted in casualties in the tens of millions, followed by an immediate and organized effort to reconstruct everything that had been destroyed and establish international agreements to prevent repetition. The agreements had not always held, but they had been made, and remade, and revised, and made again. He found the weapons records next. Humans had developed technology capable of ending all complex life on their planet, not as an accident, as an intentional weapons program. They had built enough of these devices to destroy their world several times over. And then, through decades of negotiation and political struggle and significant failure and renewed effort, they had reduced those stockpiles. Not to zero, but the reduction was documented, verified, and continuing. They built the weapon. Then they spent generations arguing themselves out of using it, while keeping enough of it to make sure no one else used theirs first. Rael called Itha in around hour 20. He showed her the footage he had found in a human documentary archive. A man in plain clothing, not military, lying flat in the dirt between the aimed weapon of a hunter and a large wounded animal the hunter was intending to finish. The man was not armed. He was not large. He was simply there in the way, and he stayed there until the hunter left. Itha watched it twice. Then she pulled up her own biological catalog of the human species and looked at it for a moment beside the footage. Soft tissue exterior, no natural armor, limited physical strength relative to many of the planet's fauna, slow reproductive cycle, extended juvenile dependency period. Human young were helpless for years, dependent on adult care for longer than almost any other species on the planet. She said, "They have the most fragile young of almost any species their size on this world." Rael said, "Yes." She said, "And they developed the capacity to destroy everything on the planet, and then chose to limit it." He said, "Not perfectly, not completely, but yes." She looked back at the footage of the man in the dirt. She said, "We spent 3 days trying to categorize Ward as a biological specimen. We measured his sensory range and his physical capability and his reaction speed, and we kept coming back to the same answer, by the numbers. He should not be at the top of anything. He should not be the thing this whole planet is organized around." Rael said, "And yet." Das had come in quietly at some point and was standing at the back of the room, reading through the translated conflict records on his own screen. He said, without looking up, "I have been reading their medical history. Their doctors used to believe that infection was caused by bad air. When they discovered microorganisms were the actual cause, they rebuilt their entire medical system around that knowledge within a few generations. They were wrong about something fundamental to survival, and they corrected it so thoroughly that the original belief is now historical curiosity." He looked up, he said, "They do that repeatedly, in multiple fields. They find out they are wrong and they change." The room was quiet for a moment. Itha said, "So what is the apex predator of this world?" Rael looked at his screen. He said, "The apex predator is the one that decides what survives, not because it kills everything else, because everything else exists within a framework it controls. Humans have been making those decisions, badly, imperfectly, sometimes catastrophically, for their entire recorded history. And the direction of those decisions over time is toward more things surviving rather than fewer." He pulled up Ward's behavioral data from the forest, the food offering, the open hands, the 2 minutes of patient stillness. He said they domesticated the most dangerous fauna on the planet, not to eat, to keep as companions. They named them. They bred them over thousands of years to be gentle. They grieve when those animals die. Das said, I read that. I did not include it in my notes because I did not know how to classify it. Rael said, neither did I still don't. He closed the data on his screen and sat for a moment in the quiet. Then he said, Grath is filing a recommendation for escalation. He wants a suppression class operation, a populated coastal city, large pulse array, landing force. Neither Das nor Itha said anything. Rael stood up. He said, I need to reach the council before he does. He was already moving toward the communication terminal when his screen lit up with an incoming fleet priority flag from Grath's vessel. The escalation request had already been submitted. Rael stopped. He looked at the screen. He looked back at the data room, at the footage of the man lying in the dirt, at the weapons records, at the conflict archives, at Ward's steady heart rate reading in the forest. He sat down at the terminal and began to type very quickly. The council approved Grath's operation at 3:40 ship time. Rael's counter-submission was still pending review when the approval came through. He read the notification and sat very still for 11 seconds. Then he got up and went to the observation window and watched the planet turning slowly below. Grath's target was a coastal city on the eastern landmass. Population estimate from thermal scans, several 100,000. The operation plan called for a wide-array low-frequency pulse to cause disorientation and temporary incapacitation across a large area, followed by a landing force of 40 soldiers to collect specimens and establish a visible presence. The goal, per Grath's report, was to demonstrate technological superiority and force formal contact on Vrethkai terms. Rael had been a surveyor for most of his adult life. He had never once thought about a species in terms of what it would feel like to be demonstrated at. Grath's vessel repositioned over the coast at 5:10. The pulse array extended from the underside of the ship, large and flat, designed to push a wide low-frequency wave across several square kilometers simultaneously. On the surface, the effect would be a sudden and intense pressure in the ears, disrupted vision, and loss of fine motor control for several minutes. Grath fired it at 5:20. The wave went out, and then something happened that was not in the operation plan. It was partially blocked. Not fully, not even mostly, but a band of the pulse wave hit an interference pattern that absorbed and scattered roughly 30% of its output before it reached ground level. Grath's instruments showed the interference source was ground-based, multiple points distributed across the city's perimeter in a way that was not random. Someone had placed them deliberately. Someone had mapped his ship's position and his likely targeting arc and had set up countermeasures before he fired. His communication officer said, "They've been tracking us." Grath said, "That's not possible. Our stealth profile." The communication officer said, "They've been tracking us for days. These ground positions match our orbital pattern exactly." Grath stared at the display. He had arrived in a stealth-rated heavy insertion vessel. He had maintained full electronic silence except for internal communications on encrypted short-range channels. The humans had no technology that should have been able to detect him, let alone track his orbital movement over multiple days and preposition countermeasures along his most logical attack vector. He ordered the landing force to deploy anyway. The pulse had still hit, not at full effect but enough. The landing ramps opened. 40 soldiers began to descend. Then every screen in Grath's command room lit up simultaneously. A signal, incoming, wideband, structured, clean. It was using a mathematical format, prime number sequences in ascending order, followed by geometric ratios. The same format humans had been broadcasting into deep space for decades looking for contact from other intelligence. It was not aimed at one ship. It was aimed at everything in orbit. Every Vrethkai vessel above the planet received it at the same moment. The signal carried two parts. The first part was a spoken message in 17 human languages delivered simultaneously, and the translation modules caught enough of the structure to piece it together within seconds. The content was, "We have known you were here. We do not want war, but if you have come to bring it, you should know what you are bringing it to." The second part was a data package. Rail opened it on his terminal before Grath's acknowledgement even came through. It was an archive, compressed, indexed, cross-referenced, the complete documented military history of the human species, every major conflict, every weapon system ever deployed in war, every tactical doctrine ever published or declassified, maps, statistics, casualty records, after-action reports, strategic analyses written by humans about their own methods, their own strengths, their own areas of catastrophic capability. It was not presented as a boast. It was presented as a reference document. As in, here is what we have done before. Here is what we are capable of. We are giving you this information freely so that you can make an informed decision about what you do next. Rail read for 3 hours without stopping. He read about industrial-scale logistics built to sustain armies across multiple continents simultaneously. He read about information warfare and psychological operations, and the strategic use of deception that had been refined over centuries. He read about weapons designed to deny access to entire geographic regions. He read about the development of coordinated multi-domain operations, land, sea, air, space, electronic, executed simultaneously, and adapted in real time. He read about the humans who had designed all of this, many of whom had spent the rest of their lives after the wars advocating against it ever being used again. He read the section on strategic deterrence and understood, with a clarity that felt cold and permanent, that the humans had not sent this archive as a threat. They had sent it because, in their own history, giving a potential enemy complete and accurate information about your capabilities before a conflict had sometimes been the thing that prevented the conflict entirely. They were not trying to scare the Vrethkai, they were trying to give them a way out. Rail opened a command channel to the entire fleet. He did not route it through Grath. He used his survey team's emergency relay, which had equal standing under deep field operational protocol. He said, "All units stand down, all units. Landing forces recall immediately. No weapons active, stand down now." His voice was completely flat, no urgency in it, just the absolute absence of any other option. There was a silence on the channel. Then Grath's voice, controlled but very tight, "Rail, you do not have command authority over." Rail said, "I have read the archive, all of it. You have not. Stand down your forces, Grath. I will explain everything to the council. But if one of your soldiers fires a single round into that city, I will not be able to explain anything, because there will not be anything left to explain." Another silence, longer. The landing ramps on Grath's vessel began to retract. Rail let out a breath he had not realized he was holding and looked back at his terminal, at the open archive, at the data still scrolling across the screen. Outside the window the planet turned, unhurried, blue and green and utterly indifferent to how close it had just come. The council session lasted 4 hours. Rail presented for most of it. He did not use dramatic language. He used the data, the footage, the archive, Grath's own field reports laid against the behavioral records from the forest. He let the information speak in the order it happened and did not try to shape what conclusion people should reach. He had found over many years of survey work that shaped conclusions tended to collapse under pressure. Plain information held. Grath made his case after. It was organized and professionally delivered. The humans were an emerging technological species on a trajectory toward interstellar capability within 2 to 4 generations by current development rate. Every simulation the Council's projection models could run showed the same result. A species this adaptive, this strategically capable, this willing to compete, would not remain on one planet indefinitely. The question was not whether to act, but when. Acting now, from a position of clear technological advantage, was the responsible choice. He was not wrong about the trajectory. Rail knew that and did not argue it. He argued something else instead. He said, "The last time a Vrethkai survey team encountered a species at this development stage and chose preemptive action, we spent 60 years dealing with the consequences. Not because the species was able to fight back, because 3 other species in that system watched what we did and changed how they thought about us. We won that engagement completely. We lost something larger and we are still calculating the cost." He paused. He said, "The humans sent us their full military archive. They know we could have struck that city. They gave us the information anyway and they asked us to make a better choice. I want to suggest that we consider what it means to be the kind of council that responds to that by hitting the city anyway." The vote took 40 minutes of closed deliberation. The neutralization order failed, 11-4. A diplomatic contact protocol was authorized. Minimal footprint, single liaison, surface landing at a pre-announced location in open terrain. Full transparency on the Vrethkai side, no cloaking, no weapons active, identification signals broadcasting on the same frequency band humans used for their own communications. Rail was named first liaison without a formal vote. No one nominated anyone else. He spent 2 days preparing. He reviewed every piece of behavioral data on Ward specifically, because Ward was the one human they had actual sustained observation on. He reviewed the food offering, the open hands in the forest, the 2 minutes of stillness. He reviewed Ward's journal entries, partially translated by now, and found that Ward had written about the encounter not with fear but with careful, almost scientific curiosity and something that translated closest to hope. He did not know how to prepare for hope. He had not encountered it often in the field. The landing site was a flat open field at the forest edge, 3 kilometers from where Ward's research camp had been. Rail brought Itha and Das. He left all weapons on the ship. He wore standard survey uniform with identification markings visible. The vessel came down with full lights on and identification signals active, which meant anyone on the surface with a radio receiver would have known exactly what was coming and where it was going to land. Ward was already at the field when they arrived. He was standing at the tree line, same field jacket he had been wearing in the forest, a small pack over one shoulder. He had someone with him, a woman, older, who Rail would later learn was a language specialist who had been working on the translation matrix since the broadcast. She had a tablet in her hands and was watching the ship descend with an expression Rail could not read yet. Rail walked out across the field first. The grass was long and wet from the night before. The sky was the pale gray of early morning, and there were birds somewhere in the trees making short, repeated calls. Ward walked out from the tree line to meet him. They stopped about 4 meters apart. Rail activated his translation module. Ward's colleague had her tablet running a parallel system. There was going to be significant loss in both directions. That was fine. First conversations were not usually about precision. Ward looked at him for a moment, not with the careful neutral expression he had worn in the forest, something more open than that. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small metal container, unscrewed the top, and poured a dark liquid into a separate cup he had brought. He held the cup out. Rail looked at it. The liquid was hot, he could see the steam. His scanner confirmed it was a water-based infusion, organic compounds, nothing toxic to his biology. He took the cup. Ward watched him hold it and then, apparently deciding that explanation was warranted, made a small gesture of drinking and pointed at the cup and then at himself and said something short that the module translated as, "We drink this. In the morning, when things begin." Rail looked down at the cup. He looked back at the planet's horizon, where the light was just starting to change. He thought about everything in the archive. about the weapons and the wars and the decades of arguments about how much destruction was acceptable and the answers humans kept revising in the direction of less. He thought about the man in the dirt between the gun and the wounded animal. He thought about Ward lying in his camp listening to a pressure wave he had never heard before and deciding, based on nothing but his own judgment, that fear was the wrong first response. He raised the cup and drank. It was bitter and hot and not entirely pleasant, and he suspected he was going to think about it for a very long time. Ward watched him with the same expression the forest had put on his face the first day, patient, curious, quietly and without any performance glad. Behind them, both the birds in the trees kept calling. The field was wet and gray and ordinary. The universe was exactly the same size it had been the day before, and somewhere above the cloud cover, in the orbital silence, a fleet that had come to catalog a monster was trying to figure out what to put in the report instead. Rail held the cup and stood in the field and decided that was someone else's problem for today. Today, he had a conversation to start.